Really, that's quite amazing. It's been a very, very emotional time for me with all of this. Wait a minute. We've just got to get something on here. There we go. There we go. It's been a very emotional time this 20 years. You know, when we talk about the long walk from freedom, well, I had a shorter walk to freedom out of the Receiver of Revenue's offices as a result of what happened 20 years ago. I met up with BDO Spencer Stewart. I couldn't go back to Deloitte's because I didn't have a tie or a jacket. So that was that. And people like John and Mark Cowley have been very pleasant and humored me for the last 20 years. It's been fantastic. Shortly after meeting up with BDO, met up with Cliff Decker through BDO, and Chris Ewing and Jonathan Vitsuensen have been great allies of mine for a very long time. And it's just super to come back and see you all and laugh with you about it, and be new South African about the budget every year. We looked for a title for this year, and yeah, we won't use the hospital passes or Lazarus. Actually, we've got to go on the basis of the long walk to freedom. The long walk to freedom will never end. It is just a goal that we are going for. So we're going to call this Part 2, which goes from Victor Verster to the FIFA World Cup. And basically, we're looking at images over 20 years that go from that to the wonder and of that which everybody said we could never achieve. We have spoken over a long period of a chap 20 years ago who looked something like that. It wasn't Cat Stevens. He then had a haircut. And gradually, he became our absolute hero. And in the course of last year, he disappeared. And what we've got to look at is the handover and the significance of that. Because 2 years ago, you would have said to me, what are we going to ever do without him? And I think that what we can, at the outset, say from yesterday afternoon, is we have a very worthy successor in Prof and Gordon. I think it was a great basically upstaged the president yesterday afternoon, 6 Love. It was absolutely fantastic. And the vibe yesterday afternoon, I was so sad to hear of walkouts in Parliament on Tuesday, because, you know, while people are walking out of Parliament, 1,500 people are dying a day from AIDS. And to see it recovered yesterday afternoon was just magnificent. But let's carry on with the story. We looked at a Trevor Manuel era which never saw a recession. From 1993 to 2009, we never had one. We just bobbled along at 4%. And in fact, during much of that period, one of my dogs could have run South Africa. You simply just added inflation and growth, and off you went. It all worked just fine. So when we came to Parliament, we presumed every year that it would be okay with Trevor. In 2007, Trevor swans into Parliament and says, I'm 32 billion rand over, here's a bunch of grapes. We are living on the fruit of our labor. And we said, well, what are we going to do next year, Trevor? And he says, well, I have the marvelous spreadsheets of Maria. Remember Maria Ramos, International Treasury? She spreadsheeted South Africa, and so we could play all these wonderful what-if scenarios. So you add 8% inflation, 5% growth, add 14% on, get 67 billion rand extra. And we sort of said, oh, okay, Trevor, that's fantastic. A year later, 2 years ago now, we go in there and we say, well, what happened? And Trevor said, I'm 14 billion over. We all said, Trevor, that's absolutely marvelous. Carry on. Nobody stopped at that point in time and said, hey, wait, Trevor. Look, the consumers had enough. Look at your VAT and your customs and excise duties. They're starting to crack. We were just so relieved and so taken up in the Trevor Manuel show that we just accepted it. So we said, what's for next year, Trevor? He says, play it again, Sam. 71 billion extra. And some of us said, hey, Trevor, have you heard of a thing called subprime? He says, subprime? That's only Investec's problem. The rest of our banks don't do that stuff, okay? We are living on record commodity prices 2 years ago. There's no reason why this whole thing can't carry on. So I'm just going to shoot the lights out. I'm going to carry on. So instead of peaches that year, we got a Sudoku thing, and we all filled in Sudoku to try and work it out how we could keep up with Trevor. A year later, we found it didn't make that 71 billion. South Africans changed. They changed from spending their Saturdays at the mall on VAT leviable to going back to bring and buy life. We maxed out our credit cards. It became too much, and suddenly the consumer got the message. in about mid-2008. So basically we started. We started on a major downsize, going from the big utes and everything else from the past down to a smaller car. Even the sushi menus changed, and we sushied our goldfish. And we basically said we're going into a whole new era on where we're going. So when we get into last year's budget, Trevor Manuel says, I'm sorry, came up 14 billion rand short. And notice, all my consumer taxes, VAT, customs and excise, transfer duty, the whole lot, are right through the floor. But he says, remember, I said we'd get 72 billion extra. We got 58 of it. So it's game on. So we say, oh, okay. So what's next, Trevor? He says, well, I haven't got anything to give you this year. This is last year's budget. 31 billion extra will be your target for next year. We'll just add 5% inflation and no growth. Although I'm still expecting the economy to grow. And we all thought from shooting the lights out on 70 billion extra a year, how could we possibly not make 31 billion rand extra? It would all be fine. So we said, well, that's fine, Trevor. Okay, we'll go for it. So then what we see is, when does the recession start? On budget day last year, our growth rates looked, as we see there on the slides, no negative growth yet. Second quarter 2008, there was a tiny piece of growth. We said, Trevor, we're heading for a recession. He says, play by the rules. A recession is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So we say, oh. January last year, we say, hey, Trevor, here's another one, okay? And now we've got a negative growth. Are we in recession? He says, no. So we had to wait until the 18th of June last year before we got the second bar. We said, hey, Trevor, what about it now? He says, I don't know, ask Prof and go down. I'm no longer Minister of Finance. And that's why we call it the biggest hospital pass since NAS. Because basically what we are seeing is Prof and Gordon fall out of SARS, get replaced by OPA, who suddenly looks at his graph of tax collections and it's gone into freefall. Why? The consumer's gone home. And now what can you do about it? So that is why we go and come back to the NASPOTA theme. Just pass it on and move on to national planning. And we've got to say, well, let's see where we go from there. So we get to yesterday in Parliament, and the big question is, how short are we going to be? And there we see the whole lot go negative. 10% down on budget. So you see, not even individuals tax making it because of the loss of 900,000 jobs. Companies coming in below budget. We thought at one stage they would be saved by higher commodity prices, but they actually lost out due to stronger rand. The consumer going home, and VAT and fuel and all the rest of it, transfer duty and the whole lot, all down. And so we're left with a 68 billion rand shortfall on increased taxes. Remember, we were going for 31. So we're currently about 40 billion rand down on last year. And immediately people say, is this a recovery? We can already see that little blip there. And we say, well, you know, there it is, there's hope. And a lot of that is taken into yesterday's budget, where they say there is a little bit of hope. So moving forward, what we say is, what are your targets for next year? Now, when we look at our targets for next year, we've got to start making this money back. And this is where we had the talk about having the great big tax increases. So if we go from the height of manual, which is, let's have grapes and throw them at each other. Then it got sticky and we got a Sudoku. What was Prof and Gordon going to give us yesterday? Lemons. Basically, what he could have done is given us all a vibrator and said, here's a tax increase, and if you don't like that, you can go and screw yourself. Because basically what we are in a position on with this whole thing is we did not have the tax base to take it. So they're saying 57 billion rand extra is required for next year, an extra 10% of taxes. In our strongest years, we have done 60 to 80 billion rand extra per year. They are asking us for next year, without an increase in taxes, to go 60 to 80 billion rand up. In other words, to shoot the lights out as we have done in the previous years. And that's not something that really came out in yesterday's budget. Then we go to how do we spend it. Now, Manuel was brilliant at this, using the marvelous spreadsheets of Maria,